Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to my series, QuickBooks Online Basics for Beginners. Today we're in episode number 4 and we are talking all about bank rules. So bank rules can be really an amazing tool, an amazing time saver in QuickBooks Online, but they can also completely destroy your books if they're set up wrong. So it's super important to pay close attention and make sure you're setting up bank rules correctly. I'm going to explain to you and show you step by step how to set up bank rules correctly, when to use them, and when not to use them. I'm also going to show you what to do if your bank rules start to get a little out of hand. So let's get into it. We're going to start with the basics. So what are bank rules? Bank rules are just automated instructions that tell QuickBooks what to do when a transaction syncs through your bank feed. All it is a set of conditions that you define to tell QuickBooks how to handle a transaction. For example, if a transaction includes the word Amazon, you can tell a bank rule to assign it to office supplies. If it's a deposit to you, you can categorize it to income. So instead of you manually entering that information on each transaction that comes in, QuickBooks can do it automatically. So when should you use bank rules? Good question. Bank rules work best when the transaction is repetitive, predictable, and from the same vendor every time. So good examples of transactions to use bank rules for would include monthly subscriptions where the amount and the vendor don't change, your monthly rent, or utilities that have the same or a similar amount each month. If you have a customer who pays you the same amount each month or each week, you can create a bank rule to tell QuickBooks to identify that. Okay, when should we not use bank rules? We're not going to use a bank rule when your transactions vary month to month. One vendor could be several different types of expenses. Take Amazon, for example. You could buy office supplies from them, but you could also buy job supplies from Amazon. Another time I wouldn't use a bank rule is if a payment needs to be applied to an invoice. In that case, we might want to use a recurring transaction. Another thing I want to point out is that a bank rule is not a recurring transaction. These are two different things in QuickBooks Online. So a bank rule is something that is created sort of as a reaction to a transaction that syncs through your bank feed. This rule, once created, only occurs when certain correct conditions are met. And these are the conditions that you assign. Recurring transactions, on the other hand, can be thought of as proactive. These are transactions that you actually create within QuickBooks Online on a schedule that you set. So very important not to confuse the two. One more kind of warning or disclaimer I'm going to throw out there is to start small when working with bank rules. Do not set up 10 or 20 bank rules to start. Set up 1 or 2, let them run for a few weeks or a month, review the results, and make sure they're behaving correctly before you try to create any more. Okay, so let's actually get into making a bank rule. We're going to want to start at the bank transaction screen. As you can see, there are a number of subtabs down here. One of them is rules. So you can go ahead and click there. You can also get there by going to the gear in the upper right-hand corner and then clicking on rules under the list column. Before we go ahead and do that, I just want to point out a couple of things that are sitting in my pending area of the bank transaction screen. So as you can see, there are 2 Google transactions pending, waiting to be categorized. One of them is from December 1st, the other is from January 1st. They're both for $8.40. And as you can see right now, QuickBooks is trying to categorize them, but we've got a different category showing up for each one, which we don't want, right? We want these 2 transactions that are the same to be categorized the same way. Remember, consistency is key when it comes to categorizing transactions. So let's go ahead and go to our bank rules screen. To create a new rule, we're going to click on this green new rule button. And we need to start by giving the rule a descriptive name. So for this one, we're going to go with Google domain hosting. Next, we need to tell QuickBooks whether this is a money in or a money out transaction. Since this is an expense, something that we pay to a vendor, we know it's a money out transaction. This transaction actually applies to the credit card we have on file, and it's never going to come from the bank account. So I can actually uncheck the bank account. Next, we need to define our conditions. So when do we want QuickBooks to identify this rule is basically what we're filling out here. And we can do this a couple of different ways. We can use the description that came in for the transaction. We can use the amount of the transaction, or we can use the bank text from the transaction. So before we go any further, I'm going to show you how to differentiate between the description and the bank text so you know exactly what to enter in this text box here for each one. So we're going to go back to the bank transaction screen and we're going to pull both the description and the bank text for our Google transaction. The bank description is going to be your description. So in this case, it's just Google. Pretty simple. If we click on the transaction to expand the row, we're going to see here the full bank description, and also there's a section for a memo. The text for the full bank description and the text for the memo are the same, but this is going to be your bank text. Since it usually comes through as a longer name, what I like to do, pro tip, is actually copy the text. So click on the text, Control C for copy. And then when we go back into our bank rule, we're going to enter Google for our description and then paste the bank text into our bank text box. The bank text is going to be a little bit different for every transaction. If we go back and look at the memo for each of these Google transactions, this one says Google Workspace and this one says Google G Suite. So this is why I don't typically use bank text, but I do use description and amount. For this one, I'm going to use the description. If you don't recall, the description for this transaction was just Google. So I'm going to go ahead and add another condition. We're going to add the amount in here because we know that this transaction is always $8.40. So we're going to identify the amount that equals exactly $8.40. Now, the next step is very important. We want to test this rule and make sure that it's working correctly. So when I click on test rule, QuickBooks is going to tell me whether this rule is going to apply to any pending transactions. And as we can see, this rule will apply to 2 currently pending transactions, which tells us that we set this rule up correctly. Now, let's say that transaction is not always $8.40, but it does range between $8 and $9 every month. I can add a condition that is an amount range. And to do that, we're going to tell this rule to apply when the amount is greater than $8, but we're going to add another condition and tell the rule to also apply when the amount is less than $9. So this is going to create a range from $8 to $9 and will include any Google transaction within that range. If we test it again, we'll see that those 2 pending transactions are getting pulled up again. Now, let's say when I was setting up the rule, I identified the amount as $8.50 instead of $8.40. When I test this rule, we're going to see that the rule is being applied to 0 pending transactions. And this rule is never going to work for us because we don't ever have a transaction for that amount. So it's very important to make sure your amount is correct. And I do think it's very helpful to define both the description and the amount when you are creating bank rules. Say we didn't, and all we did was define the condition for the amount of $8.40. Yes, we would get those 2 Google transactions that would be applied to this rule. But if we ever have any other money out transaction for $8.40, and all we're identifying here is the amount, there's a good possibility that this bank rule would identify with that transaction, even if it's for a different vendor or it should be categorized in a completely different category. Which brings me to the next step in making a bank rule, which is assigning these fields down here: the transaction type, the category, and the payee. So for this Google domain hosting expense, we're going to make sure the transaction type is an expense because it's a payment to a vendor. We're going to make sure the category is categorized as website expense. And then we're also going to add our vendor, which is Google. So we're actually going to go back up to the conditions and we're going to add a description, which was Google. And the reason we're doing this is so that no other $8.40 transactions get caught up in this bank rule that we have designed specifically for Google expenses that are $8.40. Now, the last step here is to tell QuickBooks and tell our rule whether to automatically confirm transactions that this rule applies to or not. So let's toggle this off for now and tell our rule not to auto-confirm the transactions. So we're going to save our rule, and then when we go back to the bank transaction screen, we're going to see that both of these Google transactions are still in the pending area. However, now they have a rule assigned to them, which we can tell by this green rule icon in the match categorize column of each transaction. And because this rule identified these transactions, it automatically assigned the category as website expense for both of them, and it automatically assigned the vendor for both of them as Google. All we need to do with these now is post. But let's say we did want our rule to automatically categorize these transactions. Let's go back to rules, edit the rule that we just created, and toggle on the auto add button. We're going to save this, go back to our bank transactions, and now we should see those transactions are no longer pending, which is what we're seeing here. The Google transactions are gone. They're not gone, they're just posted. So if we go to our posted transactions, we should see those in here. Here's the first one. We can see that a rule was applied to this transaction, and that's obvious by this rule icon. We can also see that this transaction was auto added by seeing this auto icon under the transaction posted column. Here's the other Google transaction that was auto posted with our rule. Okay, so let's say we have a money in transaction that we want to create a rule for. As we can see, we've got this $900 payment from a customer, and I do actually have invoices that are auto created as recurring transactions for these, but let's just say we don't have those and we click categorize. Right now this transaction is getting categorized as accounts receivable. This is just the category that QuickBooks Online is choosing. I didn't do anything to pick this category. So let's create a rule for this one. We're going to go back to rules, create new rule, and then we're going to give this rule the name customer 1 payment. Again, we need to tell QuickBooks whether this is a money in or money out transaction. This is a deposit, so it's a money in transaction. And this payment comes into the bank account. It does not get paid to the credit card. So we can uncheck the credit card and leave the bank account checked. Next, we need to, again, define our conditions. So for this one, I'm just going to use the amount. And that's because we only ever have one customer paying us this amount. If you would like, you can add another condition and again, copy and paste the description from the bank transaction screen into this text box. Also pay attention to this middle drop down. It'll let you define whether the description contains certain words or is exactly a certain word or text. I usually like to stick with contains because it's a little bit more flexible, just in case the bank description changes a little bit. We're going to actually delete this second condition and just stick with the first condition of the amount. Now we're going to test our rule. We're going to see that we did this correctly, and this rule will apply to one currently pending transaction. Then we're going to assign the transaction type, which is a deposit. The category, we're going to use an income account, services, and then in the payee dropdown is where you would add your customer. We don't have a customer called customer 1 in this QuickBooks file. We're going to leave this blank, but make sure you actually fill this out when you're creating your rule. Lastly, we can either choose to auto add or turn this toggle off. We're going to turn it off for now and hit save. We're going to see our new bank rules in this list here, and then when we go back to our bank transaction screen, if we select categorize on this transaction again, we're going to see that this rule was applied to our payment. Then all you would do is post this transaction. Okay, let's do one more example, one more new rule. Let's just say that you have a rule you want to create, but the transaction is a split transaction. For example, we pay our insurance company every month. It's a $2,000 payment, but $1,000 of the payment is for business liability insurance and the other $1,000 is for workers' compensation. So we're going to name this rule business liability and workers' comp insurance. This is going to be a money out transaction, right? It's a payment to a vendor. We're going to say that this payment comes out of our bank account so we can uncheck the credit card. And then we're going to use amount as our condition. So we're going to say the amount equals $2,000. We're not going to test the rule because we don't actually have this transaction pending. Okay, so this is where we would split the transaction down here. We're going to leave the transaction type as an expense. We're going to assign our first category as business liability insurance, and then we're going to put our payee in here. Now, we're going to add a split because we need to also tell our rule that half of this transaction is for workers' comp. So when I click on add a split, it's going to split that section into two. So we have our first section. It's asking us how we want to split the transaction. We either can split it by percentage or amount. If it's percentage, we can select percentage and type 50% in each of these text boxes. We're going to split it by dollar amount. So I'm going to click on the dollar amount drop down. I'm going to enter $1,000 in the amount field. We're going to leave this category as business liability insurance. And then on the split detail number 2, this rule is telling us that it's going to take the remaining amount of our total that we entered, and it's going to apply it to split detail 2. We're going to add our category in here as workers' comp. We actually don't have a workers' comp in this QuickBooks file, so we're not going to add it, but you definitely want to make sure you add the second category here. And then you would just click whether you want to auto add or not, and then save your bank rule. If you needed to add another line for another split, there's a button here to add a line. This will allow you to add a third split. So that's pretty much it for creating bank rules. If you ever need to edit a bank rule, I'm back at the bank rules screen here. You can always go to the edit button under the action column. If you need to pause or delete a bank rule, you can use the drop down in the action column, and you can disable your bank rule if you want to pause it for any length of time, or you can delete it completely. If you need to create another rule similar to a bank rule that you already have created, you can also copy that bank rule here. So I said it before, I'm going to say it again. Be very careful when you're creating your bank rules. If you notice that your books are looking a little off, a good place to start might be the bank rules if you have any of those set up. I think it's also a good idea to periodically check your bank rules. So go to the bank rule screen, review each rule carefully, and see if your bank rule is broken. Also make sure you're going in and reviewing your transactions periodically. Just because you have bank rules set up does not mean you don't have to check your transactions. And bank rules are not a substitute for careful bookkeeping. To recap, make sure we're only using bank rules for predictable and consistent transactions. Start with 1 or 2, review your transactions and your bank rules on a regular basis, and keep it simple. If you find yourself creating a rule, but to do so, you need more than 3 or 4 conditions, I would say just skip the bank rule entirely. All right, we made it through bank rules. If this video helped you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And always drop your comments in the comment section below if you have any questions about bank feeds or anything to do with QuickBooks Online. In the next episode, episode number 5, we're going to be talking about the chart of accounts. So common accounts for small businesses, how to deal with duplicate or unneeded accounts, how to merge accounts, and an explanation of all the different account types. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.